Have you ever felt like an uninvited guest in the very house you once called home? As if everything you gave, your love, your sacrifices, the years you spent nurturing, could be pushed aside with nothing more than a cold shrug. I never thought I would one day sit silently in the kitchen, the place that used to be the heart of the family, feeling like the help. No words of thanks, no glance of appreciation, just requests, commands wrapped in honey-sweet voices that somehow managed to sting right down to the bone. My name is Helen, and this is my story. A mother-in-law who once imagined growing old peacefully with her son and his wife, until the day I realized, maybe in their eyes, I was not a mother, just someone to be used when convenient and ignored when not. People often say if you want to know how much someone truly values you, watch how they treat you when they think you no longer matter. For me, that answer came in the smallest things, glances that slid right past me as if I did not exist, impatient words, and the silent cleanup after family meals finished out on the patio, alone. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe I was being too sensitive. But then her mother showed up, Sophie's mother, a woman who carried herself like royalty and looked at everything with quiet judgment. That was when everything became painfully clear. I was pushed to the side, and in that moment, I knew I had not just been forgotten, I had been replaced. Before we dive into this turbulent story, let's take a few seconds to do something together. Leave a comment below with a positive affirmation, a promise to yourself, something like, I deserve to be respected and loved the right way, or whatever burning truth is living quietly inside you. And if you have ever felt hurt, overlooked, or just in need of a space where your emotions are seen and understood, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. We are building a community where every feeling matters, where silence is no longer the only option. Because sometimes, in the very heart of that silence, is where a woman begins to rewrite her life. And trust me, you do not want to miss how I did that. My son, Ethan, was my entire world. I used to believe he would always be my support, the little boy who once held my hand every night and begged for a bedtime story. But now, that grown-up boy lives with his wife, Sophie, a woman so perfectly composed, she made everything else around her feel ordinary. Sophie never raises her voice, never acts rude, and somehow, that made her coldness even harder to take. She never directly asked me to cook, but she would say things like, "You know Ethan loves your stew the most, right?" She never told me to clean, but would softly say, "I'm sure you'd feel better if the house looked neat before guests arrived, wouldn't you?" They were not demands, but I knew exactly what she meant. I moved in with them after my husband, Louis, passed away. The house felt too empty, and I did not want to live alone. Ethan had always been a devoted son, so when he invited me to stay, I agreed without hesitation. I thought, what could be better than spending my later years close to my son and future grandchildren? I never imagined the place I believed would be my final haven would become the loneliest place of all. Ethan and Sophie's house looked like it was pulled straight out of a high-end interior design magazine, flawless, modern, but cold. Every object had its place, every curtain, every vase. It all followed a concept. And then there was me, with flour on my apron, wearing an old knitted sweater and the faint scent of outdated rose perfume. I did not fit in. I clashed with their aesthetic, and little by little, I became something they put up with, not someone they welcomed. I tried to blend in. I woke up early to make breakfast, watered the plants, arranged flowers. But the compliments never came. Ethan was always too busy. And Sophie, she was always polite, but the distance between us felt like an entire ocean. I used to believe that if I tried hard enough, they would see me as part of the family. But the truth is, some people will put you in a box, and nothing you do will ever change how they see you. Things got worse when Janice, Sophie's biological mother, entered the picture. A glamorous woman with an elegant voice and the kind of gaze that silently measured everything. From the first moment we met, I felt the comparison. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe. She said nothing, but the slight curl of her lips told me everything. To her, I was nothing. And then things played out exactly as you would expect in a script no one wrote down. Janice started visiting more often, I started cleaning more often, and Sophie started smiling more. But not at me. They had family traditions, special dishes from Mom's side, mother-daughter childhood stories, and I was just someone to be referred to as the nanny, or the sweet old lady who helps around the house. I do not blame them. Truly, I do not. I just never expected that even love could be categorized, that there was a kind of love that made you shine, and another kind that kept you in service. At first, I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was overreacting. After all, I was living in their house, with their rules, their lifestyle. But day by day, the small signals began to piece together a picture too painful to ignore. Every morning, I prepared breakfast, not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted to contribute. They ate in silence. Sophie would scroll through her phone as she chewed, never saying thank you, never looking at the food I had woken up early to cook. Ethan was usually rushing out the door, brushing past me and saying, "Thanks, Mom," like a lifeless reflex. At first, I was still grateful. At least he remembered. But then one day, Sophie said, "You don't have to cook anymore. We're on a new diet." And just like that, breakfast disappeared, along with that small slice of joy I had each morning. One time I suggested changing the curtains in the living room. The fabric was too thin, and the harsh afternoon sun made the room hot. Sophie smiled, but her reply was like a soft dagger. "I like natural light, and the living room is for entertaining. Maybe you're just not used to modern design." She called me Mom, but somehow the way it sounded made me feel like a stranger. But what hurt the most was the growing presence, almost intentional, of Janice. Every time she visited, I became the background. Sophie and Janice would sit outside, sipping wine, laughing loudly over stories I either did not understand, or maybe they simply did not care if I did. Meanwhile, I would be in the kitchen, washing glasses, preparing dinner, hearing their laughter float in like a sad chorus. Once, Janice asked me, "Helen, what did you do for a living?" I smiled and said, "I used to be an art teacher." She nodded, lips smiling but eyes scanning the kitchen. "Oh well, you're still very creative. Just look at how you've arranged this kitchen." Then the two of them laughed together. I smiled too, but it was not a real smile. It was forced. I almost ran into my room to cry, but I didn't. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, because I knew if I reacted, I would be labeled the difficult old lady. Whenever Sophie felt tired, Janice would stay for dinner. I cooked, of course. When I brought the dishes out, Sophie would say, "Don't worry, Mom, let me serve the guest." But who was the guest? Janice? Then what was I in this house? I remember one night, a storm was raging outside. I got up to grab a glass of water and saw Sophie and her mother curled up on the couch, watching a movie, sharing a blanket, eating popcorn. The room echoed with laughter, the kind that felt like a happy family moment. I stood in the dark, like an actual shadow. They did not see me. Or maybe they did. And just no one invited me to sit down. I did not need pampering. I did not need applause. But I needed to be seen, to be recognized as a person, not just a living utility. When did my patience become mistaken for surrender? When did my presence become such an inconvenience? Those questions began echoing louder in my mind. And then one day, the answer became painfully clear. I was not hated. I was dismissed. And that was the real heartbreak. In the days that followed, I tried to shrink myself, to appear less, to speak less. But somehow, the more I stepped back, the more clearly I saw my place being filled. One day, I walked into the living room and heard Sophie calling Janice Mom, her voice soft and natural. I froze. She had never called me that, not once, not with any real emotion. Ethan had always been the type to avoid conflict. He either did not notice, or pretended not to notice, the glances, the comments that cut into me like paper-thin wounds. I did not blame him. He was stuck between two women he loved. But sometimes I wished, just once, that he would stand beside me the way he used to when he was a boy, when kids at school bullied him, and he would cling to my hand for strength. More and more, I felt like a shadow in that house, present but unnecessary, quiet but unnoticed. One time I slipped and fell in the bathroom, not badly, just a scrape on my knee. I sat there for a few minutes, holding my knee, and what brought me to tears was not the pain. It was the fear that if I disappeared one day, no one would even notice, and then even the memories began to get erased. One evening, I decided to cook Ethan's favorite childhood dish, pumpkin soup with basil. Sophie looked at the pot, wrinkled her nose and said, "Wow, that smells pretty strong." "Ethan does not eat that anymore, Mom. He is doing a detox diet." I gave a weak smile and served myself a small bowl, but I knew it was not the soup that had changed. It was the taste of the people I loved. Janice, meanwhile, was becoming more and more of a fixture. Some days, I wondered if she even had her own home anymore. She gave her opinions on everything, from how I mopped the floor to how I folded towels. One time I accidentally folded a hand towel the wrong way in the bathroom, and she sighed, "It is okay. At your age, it is normal to forget things." Sophie laughed along, and I stood still, trying to keep my face neutral. But inside, something broke. I did not want to believe I was being replaced. The idea was too painful. But with every passing day, it felt like they were building a home, one that no longer had room for me. And I started to wonder, if I were gone, would they even realize? Or would they simply notice a cleaner house, less noise, meals without the familiar seasoning? Sometimes being dismissed does not come in the form of shouting or insults. It comes in the form of people looking right through you, as if you were never really there. And what hurt me most was that I had stayed silent for so long, they began to believe my silence meant agreement. I used to think the deepest pain came from being insulted, but no. The deepest pain comes from being ignored, from having your existence treated as something automatic, even unnecessary. And worst of all, when it happens right in the heart of the family you once loved with everything you had. The line between family and housekeeper blurred more and more with each day. No one ordered me around, no one yelled, but every glance, every gesture, every word silently screamed, "You are here to clean, to cook, to stay out of the way, nothing more." Whenever guests came over, Sophie would quickly bring Janice out to greet them, offering tea with a radiant smile. "This is my mom, Janice." No one mentioned me. In fact, many thought I was just the help. Once, a friend of Sophie's, her name was Megan, walked into the kitchen while I was cleaning and said, "Wow, the maid here is really professional." I turned around, smiled faintly, and said nothing. And Sophie? She just laughed. No correction. Nothing. I started to feel like I was nothing more than a shadow, existing only to make life more convenient for others. When Sophie had a meeting, I handled the laundry, cooked meals for the day. When Janice had shoulder pain, I took her to acupuncture, then ran to the market to get the fruits that digest better for her. When Ethan worked overtime, I had dinner ready, cleaned up after, and quietly faded back into the kitchen like I was never there. One day, Sophie announced, "Next month, my mum will be staying with us for a bit. She just had arthroscopic knee surgery and needs someone to help take care of her." I nodded instinctively, then realized I had not actually been asked. Who would care for Janice? That was already decided. Me. I asked softly, "How long?" Sophie said, "Probably 6 weeks, but do not worry. You are the most thoughtful person I know." She smiled, gently patted my shoulder like she was complimenting a loyal housekeeper. The day Janice moved in, I helped her carry her luggage upstairs. 3 large suitcases, a separate bag for her cosmetics, and a big framed picture she insisted on hanging over her bed. As I climbed the stairs, my knees started to ache, but no one noticed. No one cared. That very night, Janice complained about the mattress being too firm, the shower having weak water pressure, and the room lacking a pleasant scent. Sophie listened, then turned to me and said, "Mom, could you help change the bed sheets to the high thread count cotton ones? And tomorrow, do not forget to pick up some lavender-scented candles." I nodded. And I wondered again, am I the housekeeper and just do not realize it? I told myself, it is just 6 weeks. Then she will leave. But those 6 weeks became the longest stretch of time in my life. Each day, I became her chauffeur, driving her to therapy, to shopping trips, to nail appointments. In the evenings, I prepared her special meals, salads with very little oil, juice with no ice, soup with no onions. All those little details I had to remember. If I got them wrong, I was met with a sigh and, "You still do not get it, do you?" One time, Janice asked me to hand wash her silk blouses. I told her the washing machine had a delicate setting. She gave me a sharp look and said, "So, now you are just being lazy and blaming technology." Sophie was there. She said nothing, not a word to defend me. I began to dread waking up each morning, because I knew another day would pass where I was invisible. No one asked what I wanted to eat. No one asked if I felt okay. I lived in that house, but I was not living. I was present, but no one saw me. The breaking point came when Janice threw herself a birthday party. It was over the top. Fresh flowers, balloons, a catered buffet, a DJ playing loud music well into the night. Sophie planned the whole thing. And me? I was handed a to-do list as long as my arm. Bring up chairs from the basement, wash wine glasses, clean the living room, arrange the catering. I did it all, in silence. When the guests arrived, I stayed in the kitchen, out of sight. But when Janice stood up to give her thank you speech, I heard every word. Thank you all so much, and especially to my wonderful daughter, who made today so special. And also, thank you to Helen for keeping the house so clean. Everyone laughed, but for me that line was the final blow. Keeping the house clean. That was it. No thanks for the love, for the sacrifices, for everything unseen. To them, I was just the woman who mopped the floors. I did not cry. But that night, after the house went quiet, I sat by the window, staring into the dark, and whispered to myself, "It is over. I do not live here anymore." I could not sleep that night. The pillow was cold, but my heart felt even colder. I lay there in bed, and it felt like I was stretched out on a long bench in the hallway of someone else's life. No one noticed I was there. No one asked, "Did you sleep well, Mom?" No one realized how deeply exhausted I had become. The next morning during breakfast, I made tea as usual. Sophie was beaming into her phone, recapping the party as a huge success. Janice, still in her bathrobe, asked me to add more honey to her tea. Ethan had his face buried in his laptop. No one noticed my hands were trembling as I poured the tea. No one noticed that my eyes had run out of light. I was no longer part of them. I had become a shadow they were so used to seeing, they no longer turned their heads. But in that silence, something began to awaken. The final drop had fallen, and I knew the next thing I would do would not be to endure anymore. I cannot remember the exact moment I made the decision. Maybe it was the result of thousands of tiny moments, thousands of times I swallowed my tears and told myself, "It is okay." But the night after Janice's birthday party, I knew I could not keep living like this. Not because I was weak, but because I realized that if I stayed, I would lose myself completely. The woman who once had passions, once had worth, once had a name, not just a placeholder role in someone else's household. I started to observe more, quietly. I no longer tried to make conversation. I stopped cooking meals they did not want. I brewed tea just for myself, read old books, listened to soft music, and quietly began to tidy up my soul, like someone packing a suitcase for a long journey. But this was not a trip to escape. It was a journey back to myself. I began to write. Each night, after the house fell silent, I sat by the window under a small lamp, holding the old fountain pen Louis gave me on our wedding day. I wrote about dreams I once had, studying art in Provence, walking through lavender fields, painting with colors no one criticized. I wrote about what it felt like to become invisible, piece by piece. I wrote so I would remember that I was still alive, still feeling, and still had the right to be happy. I went through my old things. In the back of a closet, I found the film camera Louis used to carry. In a drawer under the stairs, I found the handkerchief I embroidered Ethan's name on when he had just learned to walk. Memories came rushing back, not to weaken me, but to remind me who I was before I became a shadow. One afternoon, I called an old friend, Clara, the woman I used to take art classes with in our youth. She now lived in a small village by the sea in southern France. When I told her I wanted to get away for a while, she asked just one question: "When would you like to come?" I choked up. No one had asked me that in such a long time. I began to prepare. I sold a few cherished things, the vintage porcelain tea set, the oak armchair Louis loved, and even the pocket watch my father left me. No one noticed what I was doing. Sophie was too busy with work and social media. Ethan was consumed by pressure and deadlines. Janice only needed her breakfast on time and her juice without ice. I packed only what mattered into one small suitcase, a few simple outfits, a notebook, a wedding photo with Louis, and my favorite paintbrush, each item placed like a promise that this time I was not looking back. I thought about saying goodbye, but then I realized my words had never been truly heard anyway. So why expect anything different now? I chose to write a letter, not long, not bitter, just honest. I need space to breathe. I need to find myself again, and I hope that one day you will understand. That night, I went to bed like always. No one suspected a thing. The next morning, I woke early, made myself a cup of tea. For the first time, not for anyone else, I placed the letter on the dining table, next to the dried flower vase I had once grown in the garden. Then I quietly walked out of the house I once believed would be my final home. At the end of the street, I turned back. The house stood still, like every other morning. I exhaled, lighter than I had felt in years, not because I was leaving something behind, but because I was walking towards something better, toward light, toward myself. I boarded the bus out of the city in silence. Sitting by the window, I watched the familiar streets fade behind me. Each corner, each tree, each little cafe held fragments of the years I had spent living for others. Strangely, I did not feel regret, only peace, like the kind you feel when you finally take off a pair of shoes that have been too tight for far too long. On the way to the airport, I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. No one knew I had left. And somehow, that made me feel even lighter. For the first time in a long time, I was no longer tied down by expectations or roles I had never chosen. I thought about Louis. If he were still alive, he would have supported me. No doubt about it. Louis used to say, "Helen, you were born to create beauty, not to be a backdrop in someone else's life." And now, I was going to find that again. Not to escape, but to return to myself. I thought about Ethan. I knew he would be shocked, but maybe that was the only way he would truly see everything. Sometimes we have to leave so others can feel the space we once filled. I did not want him to be heartbroken. I only wanted him to understand that his mother was also a person, with limits, with dreams, and with dignity. The plane took off, carrying me to a new sky, a place where no one knew my name, where no one called me Mom, or mother-in-law, or the house help. There, I would simply be Helen, a woman who had once lost herself in roles, but was now ready to redefine her life on her own terms. I arrived in the seaside village of Saint Laurent on a soft autumn afternoon. The breeze rustled through the old terracotta rooftops like a quiet welcome. Clara, my old friend, was waiting at the station. Her face had gained a few more wrinkles, but her smile was just as warm as ever. "You have not changed much," I said as I stepped off the train. "And you," Clara replied, squeezing my hand, "have finally come home to yourself." Clara's home was tucked beneath a canopy of olive trees, with a lavender field stretching out behind it as far as the eye could see. The air here was different. No rush, no pressure, no one judging you for not fitting into their mold. I stayed in a small room with a window that opened out onto the lavender fields. Each morning, sunlight would spill in, carrying the sound of birds and the salty breeze from the sea. I started my day by making a pot of tea, sitting by the window, and writing in the notebook I had brought with me, letting out feelings I had buried for years. Clara encouraged me to pick up a paintbrush again. At first, I hesitated. "I am too old to start over," I said. "No," she replied, "you are not old. You just never had the permission to live fully." And I knew she was right. I began with simple sketches, a lavender sprig, a distant hill. Then came paintings full of bold colors, wild, expressive, free, completely unlike the restrained life I had endured. I did not paint for praise. I painted to heal. Every afternoon, Clara and I would walk to the village market, where everyone knew each other's names and greeted with sincere eyes. I was introduced as an artist rediscovering her passion. No one asked me who I was married to or whose mother I was. I was just me. One day, Madame Marie, the cafe owner at the square, invited me to hang one of my paintings on her wall. "Your art has feeling," she said. "It makes people feel calm." I nearly cried. How long had it been since someone told me I had created something that mattered? I began writing letters to Ethan, not to scold, not to recount my pain, just to share, gently and honestly, that I was now living in a place so beautiful it almost hurt. A place where I painted, where I spoke with people, where I was seen as just a regular woman, but one who was genuinely appreciated. I did not expect him to come looking. I only hoped he would understand that I had not left out of anger. I had left to reclaim the part of myself I had lost in all those years of living for someone else. As time passed, I began to teach small art classes for the children in the village. They called me Miss Helen, but with affection, not obligation. They painted, they colored outside the lines, they laughed without guilt. And I laughed with them. A laugh I had forgotten I could still have. One afternoon I received a package. Inside was a handwritten letter, in Ethan's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was short, but it poured open like a flood. "Mom, I'm sorry. I did not see your pain. I did not see your exhaustion. I hope one day I can visit where you are, not to bring you home, but to see you truly happy. I miss you." I did not cry, but my heart, my long-numbed heart, finally felt soothed, like someone had gently placed a warm hand over an old wound. I placed the letter next to my easel, like a certificate that I was no longer invisible. From that day on, I began to write more regularly, not just letters to Ethan, but journal entries for myself. I wrote about the smell of the morning breeze, the way the children laughed in class, the quiet peace I felt when I touched my brush to the canvas. Writing, just like painting, was how I revived the parts of myself that had cracked and faded. Clara suggested I host a small exhibition at the upcoming village fair. At first, I hesitated, but then I agreed. I chose 8 paintings. Each one held a piece of my story, One showed nothing but an open window at sunrise. Another, a pair of elderly hands wrapped around a warm teacup. And one in particular, a shadowy figure of a woman standing silently in a kitchen, light slanting in through the window. That one was me, from all those years ago. On the day of the opening, the village showed up in full. I stood in a corner, quietly watching people take in each painting, their eyes sometimes misty, sometimes wide with emotion. A young woman approached me, took my hand and said, "I used to be a Helen. But your paintings remind me there is still hope." I said nothing. I only held her hand tightly, because I knew in that moment I had truly started to live again. When Ethan discovered I was gone, his first reaction was disbelief. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the letter I had left beside the dried flower vase, unable to believe what he was reading. Sophie walked in a few minutes later, phone still in hand, and asked, "Where's Mom?" Ethan did not answer right away. He placed the letter into her hand, his face stunned. Sophie skimmed it at first, then slowed down, her expression growing heavier with each word. "I thought she'd just stepped out," she whispered. "No," Ethan said, his voice thick. "She left, for real." That night, the house was eerily quiet. There was no sound of running water from the dishes being washed, no soft footsteps in the hallway, just the ticking of the wall clock, counting every second of regret. For the first time, Ethan began noticing the little things. The apron she always hung behind the kitchen door was gone. The armchair she used to sit in no longer had its cushion. In her room, everything was neatly arranged, almost too perfectly, as if she had been planning it for a long time. Then he found the small notebook she had kept hidden under her pillow. Inside were journal entries, written carefully, filled with the pain of being forgotten. Ethan sat there, reading each line like a punch to the chest. How many times had she been hurt by being overlooked? How many times had she kept quiet to avoid disrupting the family? And then he realized it was her silence that had always been the loudest voice, and he had never listened. Sophie changed too. At first, she tried to rationalize it, telling herself that her mother-in-law had been too sensitive, that everyone was busy. But when she got to the entry about Janice's birthday party, when I was thanked only for keeping the house clean, and the shame I felt after hearing people laugh, she had no more excuses. "We were terrible," Sophie whispered through tears. "We turned a good woman into a ghost." They began searching for me, calling old friends, neighbors, relatives, but no one knew anything. Sophie dug through the old letters I had sent over the years. In a faded postcard, she found the name Clara, an old friend from my youth. Following that clue, Ethan tracked down an old email address and sent a simple message. "Hello, I am Helen's son. She is gone, and we just want to know, is she okay?" 3 days later, they received a reply. "She is okay, more than okay. She is truly living. If you want to find her, come and see for yourselves." Clara's email did not say much, but it did not need to. Ethan understood. I was in a place where I was not just surviving, I was being seen. And that truth hurt more than any accusation ever could. Sophie quietly printed Clara's message and taped it to the refrigerator. Every morning after that, she saw it. It became a daily reminder that sometimes we lose people simply because we stop paying attention. Both of them began their journey to France, tracing the faint trail I had left behind. They brought with them a few of my old paintings, the letters I had written, and a deep, unspoken longing. On the plane, Sophie reached for Ethan's hand for the first time in weeks. Neither of them said a word. But in that silence, something new was being rebuilt. Understanding. In Saint Laurent, they asked around the village market, the cafes, describing an older woman with silver hair who painted and loved to tell stories. No one gave direct answers, but the smiles, the knowing looks, the quiet responses, "Oh, she teaches the kids to paint," were enough to make Ethan's heart tremble. Finally, a little boy pointed toward a small house with lavender blooming in the windowsill. "Miss Helen lives there," he said. Ethan stood before the iron gate, his heart tangled in emotion. He took a deep breath and knocked. 3 soft taps. There was no reply at first. Then, from somewhere in the back garden, a familiar voice floated in, gentle yet full of life. "Who is it?" And then I appeared, my silver hair glowing in the sunlight, paint palette still in hand, my face calm, as if I had never carried a single scar in my life. Ethan looked at me, his eyes red. "Mom, I am sorry. I came to say something I should have said long ago. I know you were always there, and I'm here now, if you will let me be." I said nothing. I stepped forward and gently placed my hand on his cheek. And in that simple touch, the distance that once felt impossible to bridge began to close. We sat at a small wooden table in the garden, the lavender rustling softly in the breeze. Sophie stood quietly nearby, hands clutching the hem of her dress, like a child who knows they have done something wrong, but has not yet found the courage to say it. Finally, I spoke. "Sophie," I called gently. She looked up. "Come sit." Sophie walked toward me, slowly, as though each step carried the weight of everything left unsaid. When she sat down across from me, she was no longer the poised, confident woman she used to be. She was a wife, a daughter-in-law, seeking forgiveness from a heart she had wounded too many times. "I do not know where to begin," Sophie choked out. "You gave us everything, and I never truly let you be part of our family." I did not respond right away. I looked at her for a long time, then said softly, "There was a time I thought I would never hear those words." "I'm sorry," Sophie cried. "I was selfish. I was so focused on building a family. I did not see that the one who laid the foundation was being left behind." "I do not expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to make it right. Not just with words, with action." I did not cry, but I gently reached out and held her hand. A small gesture, but enough to make her break down completely. In the days that followed, Ethan and Sophie stayed in the village with me. They joined me on trips to the market, helped in the garden, and even attended the art classes I taught to the local children. The kids began calling Ethan the artist's son, and Sophie became the lady who makes the best juice. And in those golden afternoons, as we sat together watching the sun dip behind the lavender fields, I shared pieces of my past, not with bitterness, not with blame, but as gentle reminders that while we cannot change the past, we can still heal the present. One afternoon, Sophie placed her hand on my shoulder and asked quietly, "Do you think you'll ever come back?" I smiled, my eyes drifting toward the horizon. "Maybe one day. But if I do, it will be as someone invited, not someone expected to serve." Ethan nodded. "I will never let the past repeat itself. I promise." And I believed him, not because of his words, but because his eyes had changed. They no longer carried avoidance. They carried understanding. They had grown because of my absence. The following spring, I did return, but this time not as a mother-in-law there to support the family. I came back as a whole woman, with a voice, with boundaries, and with a life of my own that no one was allowed to erase. Sophie met me at the airport. In her hands was a small bouquet, not expensive roses, but lavender, the flower I loved in Saint Laurent. When I walked out, I no longer wore the tired expression they used to see. I looked fresh, calm, and quietly radiant in a way I had never been allowed to be before. Sophie embraced me tightly. "We've prepared the little house by the garden just like you wanted. Even gave you your own studio to paint in." I smiled. "Thank you, but I'll live there, only if I choose to. No one decides that for me. Agreed?" "Completely agreed," Sophie said, her voice sincere. Ethan welcomed me home with a simple dinner, the first meal he had ever cooked for me himself. We ate quietly, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was filled with respect, with presence. I was no longer the one making the tea, serving the plates, scrubbing the dishes. I was a guest, welcomed and appreciated. Word quickly spread among the old neighbors that I had returned. But this time, they did not look at me with pity. They looked at me with admiration. Someone whispered, "She left like a shadow and came back like a light." And it was true. During my months in Saint Laurent, I finished writing my memoir. Silence does not mean consent. Part autobiography, part reflection, and part wake-up call for anyone losing themselves in roles they never chose. Sophie was the first to read the manuscript. When she closed the final page, she quietly wiped away her tears. "I never knew how much pain you carried," she whispered. "I know," I said, "but now you're learning how to listen, and that matters more than anything." A publisher picked up the book not long after. Soon I began receiving invitations to speak at book clubs, at senior women's groups, even on a talk show titled Second Lives, When Women Say No to Disrespect. At each event, I wore simple clothes, a lavender silk scarf, and always brought one of my paintings, a woman standing silently at a kitchen window, the sunlight cutting in. This, I would say, is who I used to be. Quiet to the point of invisibility. But all of us, we can walk out from behind that window, if we choose to. From a forgotten mother-in-law in her own home, I became a symbol for thousands of women who had suffered in silence. I was invited to international conferences about emotional resilience. Young podcast hosts featured my story as a rallying cry. A documentary filmmaker made a short film about my journey, how I disappeared to find myself again. Sophie, once the woman who saw me as a burden, became my assistant at reader events. She sat in the audience, no longer detached, but fully present, taking notes, learning, growing. She started blogging about the journey, how to admit your wrongs, how to repair, how to be kind, even if it's late. Ethan chose a different path to honor me. He spent more time by my side, painting together, walking the garden, watching the sunset in silence. He organized a special art exhibit called From Silence to Sunlight, featuring all my paintings from France. It was a full house. The press called me a living testament to the rebirth of the modern middle-aged woman. I never sought fame, but through everything I did, I shared one message with the world. You can stay silent out of love, but no one has the right to erase you. My story did not end in tears or dramatic confrontations. It ended in something quieter, but more powerful. A woman reclaiming her voice and helping others find theirs. One early autumn afternoon, when the leaves had just begun to turn gold, I wrote one final letter to Louis, my late husband. "My love," I wrote, "I have gone further than I ever imagined. I did not become a star, but I became myself again. The woman you once loved, the one you believed would shine. I lived like I promised you I would. And I know if you were still here, you would be proud." I never sent that letter. I tucked it into my sketchbook as a final chapter closed and a new one opened. A month later, I was invited to speak at a major event for midlife women. As I stepped onto the stage, applause filled the hall. I did not begin with achievements or books or travels. I simply smiled, looked out at the crowd and said, "I am not standing here because I am special. I am standing here as one of millions of women who stayed quiet, and today I speak for them, those who were once dismissed, forgotten, but who chose to step out of the shadows, because no one has the right to define who you are, but you." The entire room rose to their feet, clapping, not just for me, but for the part of themselves that had been seen through my story.